Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to the second semester of APUSH. Today we're going to start kicking things off with the Second Industrial Revolution, diving into the Gilded Age here, when the United States began to become this nation of innovation and economic growth, and really developed into the world superpower that it has become today. And so we're going to dive in. We'll see some of the robber barons slash captains of industry, talk a little bit about how some of these innovations work together to build this new modern United States, look at some of the engineering marvels that were created, and talk a little bit about the philosophy that underpins this whole second industrial revolution in the United States. So here are your objectives for today. Let's dive in and give just an overview of this whole era. Obviously, industrialization, as we've talked about before, isn't an event that happens. It's a process that's been happening over a long period of time. As we talked about last semester, the market revolution is the first industrial revolution in the United States. And this process of industrialization has been happening going all the way back to, really Hamilton pushing it in the early days of the Republic, and then really after the War of 1812. The United States has a number of things that made the Industrial Revolution sort of an easier path for us than for a lot of other people. One of them is the vast array of natural resources that the United States has. As you can see here, we've got tons of valuable mineral resources. We've got large coal deposits. We've got huge oil reserves once that becomes a thing. And so these vast natural resources are going to help become the fuel of industrialization. But the Civil War is the thing that really kicked it into high gear. The Civil War, of course, necessitated a massive transformation of the American economy, especially in the North, to build all of the industrial things necessary to defeat the South. And at the same time, you also get a national banking system that's going to finance a lot of this stuff, a standardized currency, which helps build the American economy. And all these things helped work together to contribute to the massive explosion of industrialization in the aftermath of the war. Not just because, of course, the South had to be rebuilt, but also this huge influx of capital can then be reinvested and developed into all of these different businesses. We talked previously about the whole race between Tom Thumb and a horse and the whole railroad thing. We'd also talked about the great expansion of railroads in the run up to the Civil War. But the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 is really going to kick off westward railroad building. As we mentioned last semester, it's going to lead to land grants being given to railroads, which they can then sell to help finance the building of this rail track. And so the federal government was pretty essential in the financing of building railroads because it's very expensive to invest in a new rail route. And so, in order to help incentivize that, the federal government would provide these land grants, which would then significantly increase in value as railroads went through. This led to what's called the Great Race between a variety of different companies. You could often get more land grants and more money based on the amount of track that you built. And so there was a race between a variety of different companies. The Union Pacific going from Chicago out west, and the Central Pacific going from San Francisco eastward were in this race to try to build as much track as possible. The Central Pacific used predominantly Chinese labor, whereas the Union Pacific was using predominantly Irish labor. And the Union Pacific covered significantly more ground because, of course, they didn't have to cover until they got to the Rocky Mountains. They were building it across the Plain States, whereas from San Francisco, you're going through a number of different mountain ranges to try to get out west. The challenge of digging tunnels, building on cliff sides, and things like that led this to be very dangerous work. But a lot of these immigrant communities were certainly up to the task, and the railroad building boom eventually connected the Transcontinental Railroad in 1867. Here you can see the process of tunneling under mountains in order to build railroads, which required substantial amounts of dynamite and other types of technology in order to help facilitate all of this railroad building. All of this Western expansion eventually led to the collapse of the railroad bubble. Specifically, a collapse of a railroad bank led to a massive sell-off in the stock market. It also turned out that railroad companies were bribing senators, leading in the Credit Mobilier scandal, which we talked about last semester, which is going to lead to a general financial collapse and what's called the Long Depression, this sort of economic depression in the 1870s that's going to significantly hamper American economic development. So you get another speculative bubble bursting, partially because our central banking system at this point was very decentralized. And so you didn't really have an effective lender of last resort to bail out a lot of these state banks. And the bubble itself just popped and collapsed. We also saw a massive rail strike as railroad workers attempted to exert more control and power over their sort of employment and their wages and things like that. The Great Rail Strike of 1877 is one of the first large labor movements in the United States, first large scale labor movements. And in general, it was put down by local militia and Pinkertons, with Thomas Alexander Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad suggesting giving the strikers a, quote, rifle diet, namely shooting them. So it says something about the relative power of unions versus railroads, and also the essential nature of railroads. Even now, railroads, the prospect of a railroad strike is incredibly terrifying to the United States. But in the 1870s, obviously, railroads were absolutely essential. And so a general strike would completely paralyze the nation's commerce. And so people are willing to turn a blind eye to violence against strikers and things like that. We also see the growth of steel during this time period. The Bessemer process produced a form of steel that is more durable, workable, and cheaper to produce. So we get the beginning of larger buildings, skyscrapers, larger bridges, stuff like that. Because with a metal that is less brittle, you can build longer bridges, taller buildings without risk of them falling. And so this is going to lead to a more efficient use of space within the United States. Perhaps the most impressive example of this is the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge by the Roebling family, who first invented the type of steel rope that was used to construct this massive suspension bridge, came up with an incredibly innovative way to get these sort of towers sunk down, these casements sunk in to the riverbed itself and then dug down to an appropriate length. And then, of course, stretching this steel cable across the bridge, connecting Brooklyn to Manhattan Island. This is one of the great engineering feats in American history, and the Brooklyn Bridge still stands as a fabulous testament to the innovation and technological development of the United States. So there's your Brooklyn Bridge. Very, very impressive. We're also going to see communication improvements. Alexander Graham Bell is at this point going to create his telephone. But we're also going to see a substantial consolidation of telegraph companies and the first transatlantic telegraph cable at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, which is going to allow for almost instantaneous communication with Europe, which is incredibly impressive. And so all of these feats are going to streamline communication and lead more people to be able to communicate with each other more easily, helping to facilitate communication, business, all of these sort of things. And the guy who is most associated with this era of American innovation is Thomas Alva Edison, who's going to create his Menlo Park laboratory, bringing in other scientists, developing and testing different light bulbs, phonographs, and a ton of other inventions. Obviously, the development for electric lighting is the thing that is most associated with Alva. And his battle over alternating versus direct current is part of that. So first, finding a filament that can accept electric current without burning out and would last for a long time. And then this push for electrification. Once it becomes obvious that electrification is going to be the path of the future, Edison pushed for what's called direct current, sending electrons only in one direction, and built a series of power stations to start electrifying New York City with his new electric lights. One of his co-workers and originally sort of one of his heir apparents, but eventually who broke off to form his own company, Tesla, was pushing for alternating current. Edison Alva felt like alternating current was very dangerous, and there was this massive propaganda war between the two of them over whether or not we should use DC or AC in electrifying our cities. In the end, AC is going to win because, quite frankly, it can travel stably over a longer distance, whereas with Alva's electric generation system, you'd have to have a new power station every couple blocks in order to electrify a city. But Edison was totally convinced that alternating current was super dangerous, famously using it to electrocute a lot of animals, most famously electrocuting elephants to show how, again, dangerous it was. And the propaganda war also led the development of the electric chair, this execution device that would use alternating current to kill people, as again part of this propaganda piece to argue that AC was too dangerous to use. Eventually, Edison's company was bought out by a guy named J.P. Morgan, who we're going to become familiar with later, and consolidated into General Electric Company, which is going to electrify New York City, eventually move over to alternating current, and then slowly start electrifying other cities on the East Coast and moving into the Midwest. The growth of monopolies and trusts is going to significantly increase the economic development of the United States. A monopoly is, of course, where you buy up all of the other competitors working within your same field. A trust is where you get a variety of different companies that are consolidated within one corporate structure. And so, especially for railroads, which became the first monopolies, buying up other companies getting monopolies on the use of other technologies, like the Westinghouse air brake, which would allow all cars on a train to brake simultaneously, or the Pullman rail car, which were much more comfortable sleeping cars that would allow for long distance travel in luxury and comfort. The consolidation and the use of these technologies would allow especially incredibly wealthy industrialists like Cornelius Vanderbilt to consolidate railroads together and then push out competition. Vanderbilt specifically was able to drive a rail or to connect a rail line directly into downtown New York City, which then allowed him to provide much cheaper and more convenient service than his competitors and would allow him to create a massive rail empire. Here's Cornelius So take a minute and pause and read Vanderbilt's account here, and you can see him as the colossus of the modern colossus of railroads from Puck magazine. All of this railroad trust building led to the creation of these incredibly, incredibly wealthy railroad barons who would then take over sections of the company and try not to directly compete with each other, lest they get into incredibly, incredibly disastrous bidding wars. And so you start to see the country being carved up by these various sort of rail tycoons. So take a moment, pause, and read the effects of consolidation here. And then we'll dive into Rockefeller and Carnegie. Generally, the effect of monopoly is that a monopolist no longer has to pay attention to other competitors, so he doesn't have to pay any attention to actual demand. He could set his prices at whatever he wants because there's no competitors who are going to be underbidding him. So the result is a monopolist will instead choose to set their price at the intersection of the marginal revenue and marginal cost curves, significantly increasing the price of a good, cutting down on consumer surplus and increasing producer surplus. This is going to lead monopolists to maximize profits and become spectacularly wealthy. Here's Rockefeller describing the dangers of competition and how individuals could, again, become spectacularly wealthy because of this. The two methods that were used generally by monopolists were horizontal and vertical integration. Vertical integration, who's going to be pioneered by a guy named Andrew Carnegie, is going to purchase all levels of the production process. So in a meat production company, you're buying your own cows, your rail cars, your delivery wagons, etc., which allows you to control the price and the quality of each stage of the production process and thereby underbid your competitors with a higher quality good. Whereas horizontal integration is the buying up of all of one stage of the process. So, for example, Rockefeller is going to buy up all the other oil refineries, creating what we think of as more of a traditional monopoly, and then allowing him to price discriminate and set whatever price he wants, as opposed to having to pay attention to market forces. So here's Rockefeller describing the potential advantages of this and disadvantages. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil is sort of the first monopoly. It's more or less a rags to riches story of Rockefeller starting out as a low-level employee and is able to work his way up, buy his own oil refinery. And by 1880, he controlled 90% of the oil refineries in the United States. His method of refining, especially refining of kerosene and other sort of oil types of oil distillation, is going to allow Standard Oil to more effectively use the oil that they are manufacturing. Or, I mean, obviously, I'm not a scientist here, so this is going to move into areas that I totally don't understand. But his ability to refine crude oil into a number of different types of sort of useful byproducts is going to lead Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Company to become spectacularly wealthy. And here's Ida Tarbell explaining how he then maintains that wealth. Standard Oil then becomes this incredibly powerful monopoly, can exert pressure on its competitors and the government, and eventually is going to become so large that the government is going to decide that they're going to need some measure of regulation to push back against it. But that's for another lesson. The other guy associated with this movement is Andrew Carnegie, who was a poor immigrant from Scotland who started out as a clerk in a mail room and eventually was able to put together this massive sort of steel production plant in Cleveland, Ohio. So Carnegie Steel Company becomes one of these incredibly powerful monopolies. Carnegie, as opposed to going for horizontal integration, instead goes for vertical integration, buying up iron ore boats and iron ore mines, shipping iron ore across the Great Lakes to then his refinery in Cleveland, Ohio, and using this to make Carnegie Steel an incredibly efficient company and make himself spectacularly wealthy. Eventually, JP Morgan is going to buy out Carnegie Steel as well as a whole bunch of other steel companies to create the horizontally integrated US Steel. And US Steel is going to become the main producer of steel throughout the rest of the Gilded Age, and JP Morgan becomes spectacularly wealthy because of it. Here's the logo for US Steel, based in Pittsburgh. You're probably familiar with it. This idea that monopolists are making society better because of their skill at business is known as social Darwinism. This becomes one of the ways that monopolists justify their wealth is you take Darwin's theories and you say, just like animals who are well adapted are going to thrive and multiply, businesses and businessmen who are well adapted are going to thrive and multiply. And so social Darwinism becomes the explanation for why monopolists are so wealthy. And the gospel of wealth is the philosophy that argues that wealthy people can do more good for the poor than if the wealth was more evenly distributed. Basically, the idea that these wealthy people now have the resources to make vast changes in society. For example, Carnegie is going to found a bunch of libraries. Rockefeller is going to do a whole bunch of different philanthropic work with public spaces and concert venues, things like that. And we're going to see huge amounts of investment from these wealthy people giving their wealth back to society in a variety of different ways, founding universities, stuff like that. So that's the basic ideology of all of this. And to what extent is it true? I mean, kind of. Carnegie certainly did give a lot of his money away, although there's also problems associated with the concentration of wealth in a few people's hands. So that's what we have for today. Just a brief overview of these industrialists. All of these guys are going to pop back into our story. Make sure you know horizontal and vertical integration. And when we come back, we'll start talking about the effect of these both on the national government and also on local governments and municipal governments. So thank you for listening.